The morning Esther Whitcombe arrived at Beaumont House, it was raining, not the gentle kind of rain that softens the edges of things, the kind that comes down sideways, that finds the gaps in your collar and the seams of your boots, that makes you feel the world has no particular interest in your comfort. She stood at the iron gate with a single travelling case and a letter that had already softened at the folds from being read too many times. The butler, a man named Graves, which Esther later thought was either a warning or a coincidence, opened the gate without a word and led her up the gravel path without looking back to see if she was following. She was following. She had no other choice. That was the first thing you needed to understand about Esther Whitcombe. She had always been a woman defined by the absence of alternatives, not by weakness, by arithmetic. Her father, Gerald Whitcombe, had been a man of considerable warmth and catastrophic financial judgment. He had died 14 months prior, leaving behind a house with a mortgage, a name with a reputation, and a daughter with neither resources nor the willingness to pretend otherwise. The letter in her coat pocket had come from the offices of Caldwell and Marsh, attorneys at law, and its language was the language of men who had no interest in how things felt, only in how they stood legally. The terms were as follows. Miss Esther Whitcombe would enter into a contractual marriage arrangement with Mr. Lionel Beaumont of Beaumont Steel and Iron, Incorporated, for a period of no less than 18 months. During that time, she would reside at Beaumont House in Fairmont Hills, assume the full social role of Mrs. Beaumont, and conduct herself in accordance with the expectations of that position. In exchange, Mr. Beaumont would clear the Whitcombe estate debt, $42,000 in full, and make reasonable provision for Miss Whitcombe's financial independence upon the arrangement's lawful dissolution. There was no mention of affection. There was no mention of children. There was no mention of anything that could be confused with tenderness. She had read it 6 times. She had wept once, privately, efficiently, and only once, and then she had written back to Caldwell and Marsh with her signature at the bottom of the page. That was 3 weeks ago. Now she was here. Beaumont House was not beautiful the way that houses built to impress are beautiful. It was beautiful the way geological formations are beautiful, by scale, by permanence, by the sheer indifference of its own mass. 4 stories of dark stone, enormous windows that reflected the grey sky back at you like mirrors that had given up on flattery, iron details on every balcony railing. It had been built by Lionel Beaumont's father and expanded by Lionel himself, and it did not look like a home, it looked like a headquarters. Graves showed her to a sitting room on the ground floor and left her there without explanation. She did not sit. She stood near the window and watched the rain move across the garden. A garden that was immaculate, rigidly symmetrical, every hedge trimmed to perfect right angles. And she thought about what her mother would have said. Her mother had been dead for 11 years, but her voice had never entirely left. She would have said, "Esther, you have made your bed," and then she would have helped her make it properly. The door opened. He did not knock. This was the first thing she noticed about Lionel Beaumont. He did not knock in his own house. Not from rudeness, precisely. It simply did not occur to him that any space within these walls might, even temporarily, belong to someone other than himself. He was tall. That registered first. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quiet way that physical presence sometimes does, when a person has spent many years being the tallest authority in every room they entered. He wore a dark suit, no unnecessary ornamentation, the kind of clothing that communicated wealth by refusing to discuss it. His hair was dark, with the first suggestions of grey at the sides. His face was not unkind. That was the most precise description Esther could settle on, standing there in the grey morning light. Not unkind. Simply closed, a face that had made a deliberate arrangement with its own emotions somewhere along the way, and had not revisited the agreement since. He looked at her the way a man looks at a contract he has already signed, with assessment rather than curiosity, with the particular expression of someone confirming that what has arrived matches what was agreed upon. "Miss Whitcombe," he said. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. A pause. Not uncomfortable, exactly, or perhaps entirely uncomfortable, but neither of them chose to acknowledge it as such. He walked to the desk near the far wall, opened a leather folio, and produced a single sheet of paper. He set it on the desk without extending it toward her, which meant she had to cross the room to reach it. She did so without hesitation, without hurrying, and she stood close enough to read it without picking it up. It was a summary of the terms, the same terms she already knew. "I wanted to confirm," he said, "that you understood what you agreed to." "I understood the letter from your attorneys," Esther said. "I don't require a second reading." Something shifted slightly in his expression, not enough to name. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then closed the folio. "The wedding will take place on the 14th, he said. "Quiet ceremony. Justice of the peace. 2 witnesses. No announcement in the Fairmont Gazette until after the fact. That suits me. The household staff has been informed that you are a guest until the ceremony. After that, you will be introduced as my wife. The staff will treat you accordingly." He said this with the tone of a man issuing internal company policy. "I expect the arrangement to be managed with discretion on both sides." "I have no interest in anything other than discretion," Esther said. He nodded once. He picked up the folio. He moved toward the door. "Mr. Beaumont." He stopped. Esther kept her voice level, not challenging, simply precise. "I want to be clear about one thing." He waited. "I am entering this arrangement because my circumstances have left me no alternative I could accept with any self-respect. That does not mean I have forfeited my self-respect by accepting it. I will behave exactly as agreed. I will be whatever you need me to be in any room where that is required. But in this house, in private, I would like to be treated as a person, rather than a line item in a financial resolution." The silence that followed was long enough that she became aware of the rain against the glass again. "That's a reasonable request," he said at last. And then he left. She did not see him again until dinner. The dining room at Beaumont House was long enough that the candlelight from the centerpiece did not quite reach both ends of the table. He sat at the head. Graves had placed her setting at the far end, which struck her as either a statement or simply the default configuration of a house that had not had a woman at the table in a long time. The meal was served in courses. The food was excellent. The conversation was nearly non-existent. At some point between the soup and the roasted lamb, he said, "Your father knew my father." Esther looked up. "I know. They were not friends." "No," she agreed. "But they did business. Bad business, ultimately." "Yes." She set her fork down. "I am aware of the history, Mr. Beaumont. I am not under any illusion about why I'm here." He looked at her from the far end of the table. "I didn't say it to wound you. I know you didn't. You said it because it's true, and you see no reason not to say true things." Another pause, and then, briefly, so briefly she almost doubted it, something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of expression crossed his face. Not warmth, not yet anything close to warmth, but something adjacent to it. The way a window can let in the suggestion of light even when the curtain hasn't been opened. "You may call me Lionel," he said, "if you prefer." She picked her fork back up. "I prefer Esther," she said simply. He said nothing further, but he did not look away immediately, and that, she would remember later, was the first small thing. That night, in the room that Graves had prepared for her, a room that was large and cold and furnished with the precision of a room that had never been truly lived in, Esther sat at the writing desk and opened the drawer. Inside was a document she had brought with her, not the marriage contract, something older, something her father had given her 7 years prior, with instructions she had never been able to bring herself to follow. She did not read it. She simply confirmed it was there, closed the drawer, locked it with the small brass key she kept on a ribbon inside her left sleeve. Outside, the rain had not stopped. The garden lay in darkness below her window, every hedge still standing at its perfect right angle, the iron gate invisible in the black. She thought about the look on Lionel Beaumont's face when she had told him she expected to be treated as a person. That's a reasonable request. Not warmth, not generosity. Reasonableness, the bare minimum of recognition. And yet she had felt it land somewhere in her chest, like something she hadn't known she was waiting to hear. She extinguished the lamp. In 9 days, she would become Mrs. Beaumont, and not one person in Fairmont Hills, not the attorneys, not the steel barons, not the women who would smile at her over their china cups, knew what was locked inside that drawer. Not yet. 9 days passed the way that certain kinds of waiting always pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a particular weight that settles into the shoulders and stays there. The ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning in the office of Justice Harold Pembroke, a small man with an enormous desk, and the expression of someone who had presided over enough of these arrangements to have stopped asking questions. 2 witnesses signed the document, Graves, the butler, and a woman named Mrs. Aldred, who managed the household accounts and looked at Esther with neither warmth nor hostility, only the careful neutrality of someone who understood her position precisely and had no intention of revising it. The entire proceeding lasted 11 minutes. Lionel Beaumont signed the certificate. With the same hand he likely signed steel contracts, steadily, without ceremony, with the pen already moving toward the blotter before the ink had fully dried. He did not look at Esther when he signed. She did not look at him when she signed. They stood side by side at the edge of Harold Pembroke's enormous desk, like two people waiting for a train, rather than two people being legally joined. And when it was done, Lionel said thank you to the justice, nodded once to Graves and held the door open for Esther on their way out. It was the first time he had held a door for her. She noticed. She filed it away and said nothing. The ride back to Beaumont House was quiet. The carriage moved through the center of Fairmont Hills, past the bank and the telegraph office and the wide storefronts of merchants who supplied the households of the wealthy, and Esther looked out the window at the town that was now, in some technical and contractual sense, her home. Fairmont Hills was not a large city. It had approximately 4,000 residents, a single newspaper, 3 churches of varying denominations, and the kind of social hierarchy that forms naturally in places where old money and new industry have been sitting next to each other long enough to resent each other fluently. The Beaumont name sat at the top of that hierarchy, with the effortless authority of a boulder at the summit of a hill. No one had put it there recently. It had simply always been there. Esther had grown up at the edge of that world, close enough to know its geography, never quite inside it. Now she lived at its center. The first week of their shared life at Beaumont House established itself like a set of rules that no one had written down, but everyone was expected to follow. Lionel rose before 6. She knew this because she heard his study door close on the floor below her room each morning, with the quiet precision of a man who had kept the same schedule for so many years that his body simply continued it without instruction. By the time she came downstairs at 7:30, he had already reviewed the morning correspondence, eaten a breakfast he apparently preferred to take alone, and in most cases was already in discussion with one of the several men who appeared at Beaumont House with the regularity of employees, which she later understood they effectively were. Dinner was the only meal they reliably shared. It was not uncomfortable exactly. It was something more specific than discomfort. It was the sensation of two people in a room that had been designed for something neither of them was performing. Intimacy, ease, the natural conversation of a household, and both of them aware of the gap between the room's expectation and the reality of what was actually happening inside it. He asked her on the 3rd evening whether she had found everything she needed in her rooms. She told him yes. He asked on the 5th evening whether she had any particular requirements regarding the household schedule that she would like to discuss with Mrs. Aldred. She told him she would speak with Mrs. Aldred directly. He nodded and returned to his soup. On the 7th evening, he said nothing at all for the first 40 minutes of the meal, and Esther sat at her end of the long table and ate her roasted chicken and thought about the document in the drawer upstairs and felt, for the first time since arriving, something that was not anxiety or grief but something sharper and more active, something that required a decision. Not yet, but soon. What she had not expected was the library. Beaumont House had a library on the 2nd floor, a room she had not been shown during her first tour of the house, which had been brief and functional and led by Graves rather than Lionel. She found it herself on her 8th morning, following the corridor past the room she had been using as a small sitting room, and she pushed open a door that she had assumed led to a linen closet. It did not lead to a linen closet. It led to a room with floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a reading chair positioned near the window, with the particular worn quality of furniture that has been used with genuine frequency, a side table with a lamp, and approximately 1,000 books organized with a system that was not alphabetical and not by subject, but by something else, some internal logic she could not immediately identify. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then she went inside. She was there for 2 hours. She was examining the spines along the far wall, history mostly intermixed with engineering texts and, unexpectedly, 3 volumes of poetry, when she heard the door. Lionel stood in the frame. He was in his shirt sleeves, which was the most informal she had seen him. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has found something in a room where he did not expect to find anything, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I apologize," Esther said. "I wasn't told this room was private." "It isn't." He looked at the shelf she had been standing at. "You found the poetry. It surprised me." A pause. "Why?" She considered being diplomatic. "You don't strike me as a man who reads poetry." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother read it," he said. Those were hers. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother. It was the first time Esther realized that he had offered her any information about himself that had not been strictly required by the logistics of their arrangement. It was small. It was 3 sentences, but in the architecture of their particular silence, it had the weight of something much larger. "I won't disturb you," she said, and moved toward the door. "You're not disturbing anything," he said. Then, as if the words had arrived slightly ahead of his intention to say them, he added, "You can use the library whenever you like. There's no schedule for it." She nodded. He moved to his reading chair. He picked up the book that was already there, open and face down on the armrest. He began reading. She stayed, not in his chair, not near him. She took a book from the shelf, one of the history volumes, and settled on the small bench near the opposite wall. And they read in the same room for an hour and 15 minutes without speaking, and it was the most peaceful Esther had felt since before her father died. What she did not know, what she could not have known, sitting in that library with the afternoon light coming through the window, was that Lionel Beaumont had been told something about her, not by the attorneys, not by Graves, by a man named Douglas Pratt, who was Lionel's financial advisor, his longest-standing associate, and the single person in Fairmont Hills who knew the actual architecture of the Beaumont Empire more precisely than Lionel himself. Douglas Pratt had come to Beaumont House on the 6th day of Esther's residence there, had spent 40 minutes in Lionel's study with the door closed, and had left without passing through any room where Esther might have seen his face. What he had told Lionel was this, that there was a document, unspecified in nature, unknown in its precise contents, that had been in Gerald Whitcombe's possession at the time of his death, and that according to at least one source whose reliability Douglas Pratt had not fully confirmed, that document had not been destroyed with the rest of the Whitcombe estate papers, that it might, in fact, still exist. Lionel had said nothing in response. He had thanked Douglas Pratt for the information. He had shown him to the door. And that evening at dinner, he had watched Esther Whitcombe eat her roasted chicken at the far end of his table, and he had said nothing for 40 minutes. On the morning of the 14th day of their marriage, a letter arrived for Esther. It bore no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was a hand she recognized, not from recent correspondence, but from her childhood, from a name she had not spoken in years. She did not open it at breakfast. She carried it upstairs. She locked the door of her room. She opened it. She read it once. She sat down on the edge of the bed and held the paper in both hands and looked at the wall for a very long time. Then she went to the writing desk. She unlocked the drawer. She looked at the document her father had given her 7 years ago, the one she had carried to Beaumont House in her traveling case, the one she had never shown anyone, the one whose existence she had never confirmed to a single living person. The letter she had just received made one thing very clear. Someone already knew it was there. Whatever protection silence had given her, it was over. There are secrets that people carry the way they carry grief, quietly, privately, with the particular discipline of someone who has learned that the weight becomes manageable only if you never set it down. If you set it down, even for a moment, you remember how heavy it actually is. Esther Whitcombe had been carrying hers for 7 years. She had been 19 when her father called her into his study on a Thursday evening in October, closed the door, and placed a document on the desk between them with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for longer than he would admit. He had looked older that evening than she had ever seen him. Not tired. Something more specific than tired. The look of a man who has been holding a structural wall in place by himself for a very long time and has finally decided to tell someone else that the wall exists. The document was a deed, not for Whitcombe House, for something older, something predating even her grandfather's estate. A parcel of land in the northern valley outside Fairmont Hills, approximately 400 acres, purchased quietly in 1861 by a man named Lionel Beaumont, Lionel's father. Purchased, according to the deed of transfer that accompanied it, from a man named Gerald Whitcombe, her father. But the transfer had never been fully executed. There was a clause, handwritten, initialed by both men, witnessed by a single notary whose stamp was still legible in the lower left corner, that stipulated the land would revert to Whitcombe ownership in the event that Beaumont Steel and Iron failed to complete a specified infrastructure commitment to the Northern Valley within 25 years of the original purchase date. The commitment had never been completed. Esther had confirmed this herself, 3 years after her father gave her the document, through careful and very quiet inquiry with a land surveyor who owed her a favor and asked no questions in return. 25 years from 1861 was 1886. 1886 had passed 7 months ago, which meant that 400 acres of land in the Northern Valley, land that sat directly beneath the proposed route of the Eastern Fairmont Railroad expansion, land that 3 separate investment groups had been quietly acquiring adjacent parcels around for the past 2 years, land whose value had increased by a figure Esther could not calculate without access to current railroad contracts, legally belonged to the Whitcombe estate, to her, and Lionel Beaumont did not know it existed, or so she had believed until the letter arrived. She read it a second time at the writing desk, with the document open beside it, the brass key still in her hand. The letter was from a man named Samuel Voss. She had known Samuel Voss as a child. He had worked as a clerk in her father's office for nearly a decade, a quiet man with careful eyes, who had always treated her with a particular gentle formality, as though he understood that she noticed more than she was given credit for. He had left her father's employ 3 years before Gerald Whitcombe died, and she had not heard from him since. The letter was short, 5 sentences. Miss Whitcombe, or I suppose I must now say Mrs. Beaumont, I write not to threaten but to warn. There are people asking questions about your father's papers. I have kept what I know to myself, but I am not the only one who knew. Whatever you have in your possession, you must decide what to do with it before someone else decides for you. SV. She folded the letter. She placed it inside the document. She locked the drawer. Then she sat very still and thought about Douglas Pratt. She had not met Douglas Pratt, but she had seen him. Or rather, she had seen the back of him, leaving through the front door on the 6th day of her residence, a man with a grey coat and the particular gait of someone who moves through the world as though he owns slightly more of it than he actually does. She had asked Graves who he was. Graves had said, "Mr. Beaumont's financial advisor, ma'am," in the tone of a man answering the question that was asked, and not one word beyond it. She thought about that closed study door. She thought about Lionel's silence at dinner that evening. She thought about the library and the poetry, and the hour and 15 minutes they had spent reading in the same room, and she felt something that was not quite betrayal, because nothing had yet been confirmed, but something adjacent to it. The anticipatory grief of a person who can see a fracture forming in a thing they had not realized they had started to value. She was careful after that, carefully normal, carefully present. She attended the first social engagement of their marriage, a dinner at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Aldgate, 2 of the 4 wealthiest families in Fairmont Hills, on the Friday of the 3rd week. She wore a dress that was appropriate without being remarkable. She spoke when spoken to, and asked questions that invited people to talk about themselves, which was the single most effective social technique she had ever discovered. She laughed at the right moments. She deferred to Lionel on questions about business, which was expected, and offered her own opinions on questions about the city's cultural development, which was just barely within the acceptable range of what women were permitted to do in that room. 3 women complimented her on her composure. One man, a railroad investor named Harlan Fitch, whose handshake lasted slightly too long, said to Lionel, within Esther's hearing, "She's not what I expected, Beaumont." He said it with the tone of a compliment that wasn't entirely one. Lionel said, without looking at Harlan Fitch, and with a flatness that closed the subject entirely, "No, she isn't." In the carriage home, Esther looked out the window at the dark streets of Fairmont Hills and thought about Harlan Fitch and the railroad and the 400 acres in the northern valley, and the way that everything, when you knew where to look, was connected to everything else. She thought about what Lionel knew, what he suspected, whether the Douglas Pratt conversation had been about her specifically or about the document or both. She thought about the clause. She thought about 1886. "You were good this evening," Lionel said. She looked at him across the dark interior of the carriage. He was watching her with the expression she had come to recognize, not closed, exactly, more like a door that is not locked but requires a particular kind of pressure to open. "I was myself," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I meant." The confrontation, when it came, arrived not as a confrontation but as a question. It was a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the letter from Samuel Voss. They were in the library. This had become, without either of them formally deciding it, the room where the edges of their arrangement relaxed most naturally, not into warmth, precisely, into something less defended. He read. She read. Occasionally, one of them spoke. It was the closest thing to ease that existed between them, and Esther had come to protect it, the way you protect something fragile that you're not sure you're allowed to want. He looked up from his book. Esther. Something in the way he said her name was different, not harder, more deliberate, the way a person says a word when they have been deciding whether to say it for some time. "Yes. Did your father keep records of his business with my father?" The room held its breath. Or perhaps that was only her. She kept her face entirely still. This was a skill she had developed over years of being underestimated in rooms full of people who believed she wasn't listening. the ability to absorb something without visibly receiving it. "My father kept records of most things," she said. "His estate papers were handled by the attorneys after his death. I don't have access to them." This was true. It was also not an answer to the question he had asked. Lionel looked at her for 3 full seconds. In the context of his particular economy of expression, 3 full seconds was the equivalent of a much longer and more revealing look from anyone else. "Douglas tells me there may be a land agreement," he said, "from 1861 involving both families." "Douglas Pratt," she said. "Yes. And what does Douglas Pratt believe about this agreement?" "He believes it may have implications for the railroad expansion." A pause. "Significant ones." Esther set her book down on the bench beside her. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at Lionel Beaumont, at the face that was not unkind, at the door that required a particular kind of pressure, and she made the decision that she had been approaching for 3 weeks without allowing herself to fully arrive at it. Not tonight. Not yet. She needed 3 more days. She needed to speak with someone first. "I'll look into what records I may have," she said. "From my father's personal correspondence. Give me a few days." He nodded, but as she rose to leave the library, she heard him say quietly, not quite to her and not quite to himself, "I'm not asking to take anything from you, Esther." She stopped in the doorway. She did not turn around. "I know what you're asking, Lionel," she said. "That isn't what concerns me." She walked down the corridor. She went to her room. She locked the door and sat at the writing desk and looked at the locked drawer for a very long time. What concerned her was not what he would take. What concerned her was what she would lose in the giving, and whether, by the time the truth came fully into the light, there would be anything left between them worth preserving. 3 days later, Douglas Pratt arrived at Beaumont House with a letter from Harlan Fitch's attorneys. It was not a question this time. It was a claim. Someone had told Harlan Fitch about the clause, and it was not Esther. The letter from Harlan Fitch's attorneys arrived on a Thursday morning and sat on Lionel Beaumont's desk for exactly 4 hours before he summoned Douglas Pratt back to Beaumont House and closed the study door behind them both. Esther knew none of this when she came downstairs. She knew it the moment she saw Graves in the entrance hall, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has absorbed bad news and is now managing its containment, and she understood, with the clarity that comes to people who have spent their lives paying attention to what others overlook, that something had broken open. She did not go to the study. She went to the library. She unlocked the drawer she had carried in her mind for 3 weeks. She went upstairs. She took out the document and the deed and Samuel Voss's letter, and she held them in both hands, and made the decision she had been circling since the night her father placed them on his desk between them and said, "Esther, this is yours now. I'm sorry it took this shape." She understood now what he had meant. He had not been apologizing for the burden. He had been apologizing for the position, for building a situation in which the only way his daughter could protect herself was to hold a secret that would one day require her to decide between her own survival and something she could not yet name, because she had not yet lived through enough to know what it was. She knew now. She came downstairs with the documents in her hand and knocked on the study door. The knock surprised him. She could see it, a fractional adjustment in his posture, the almost imperceptible recalibration of a man who had not expected the door to move toward him rather than away. Douglas Pratt was standing near the window. He was exactly as she had constructed him from the back of a grey coat and Graves's careful answer, a man of middle years, precise in his movements, with the kind of face that reveals nothing because it has spent decades learning to reveal nothing. He looked at the papers in her hand. Something moved behind his eyes. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said. "Mr. Pratt," she said. She set the documents on Lionel's desk. Not pushed across, not surrendered. Set down, with the deliberateness of a person who is giving something voluntarily and intends that distinction to be understood. Lionel looked at the papers. He looked at her. He did not reach for them immediately, which told her something about him that she had not fully confirmed until that moment, that whatever else he was not a man who grabbed. "The deed of transfer from 1861, she said, "a conditional sale between Elias Beaumont and Gerald Whitcombe. 400 acres in the Northern Valley, with a reversion clause tied to an infrastructure commitment that was never fulfilled. The 25-year window expired 7 months ago." She paused. "The land is legally mine," Douglas Pratt said with the careful neutrality of a man who has been in difficult rooms before. "Mrs. Beaumont, the legal standing of that clause is not yet..." Mr. Pratt, she said his name quietly, not aggressively, with the same precision he had used on hers. I am not speaking to you. The room went very still. Lionel picked up the deed. He read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at the reversion clause and was silent for a long time. How long have you had this? He said. It was not quite a question. 7 years. He looked at her then, fully in a way he rarely did, with the door not just unlocked but open. She could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes. The 7 years, the marriage arrangement, the $42,000, the 18 months. She watched him understand. You came into this house, he said slowly, with legal claim to land worth more than the debt we used to bring you here. Yes, and you said nothing. I needed to understand what I was walking into before I decided what to do with what I was carrying. She kept her voice steady. I needed to know whether this house was a place where the truth had any value at all. Douglas Pratt shifted near the window. The Fitch claim. The Fitch claim is based on information that came from your office, Mr. Pratt, Esther said. Samuel Voss was my father's clerk for 9 years. He knew about the document. He also wrote me a letter warning me that someone was asking questions about my father's papers. She looked at Douglas Pratt with the same expression she had used in the Aldgate dining room. Calm, direct, entirely without performance. I don't believe the questions originated with Harlan Fitch. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence Esther had previously experienced in Beaumont House. It had weight and direction. It was pointed at Douglas Pratt. Lionel stood. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Get out of my house, Douglas." Pratt opened his mouth. "Now," Lionel said. "One word. The kind of word that does not require elevation to carry force. The kind that has been building pressure for a long time and requires only one syllable to release it." Douglas Pratt gathered his coat from the chair. He walked to the door. He did not look at Esther as he passed her, which was answer enough. They were alone. Lionel stood behind his desk. Esther stood on the other side of it. Between them were the documents and the deed, the clause, the reversion, the architecture of everything. "He was going to sell the information to Fitch," Lionel said. "Not a question. I believe so. Before I had the chance to use it myself. Before either of us understood what the other actually held." She paused. "He may have been the one who suggested the arrangement to you in the first place. It would have been a convenient way to keep the document inside your reach without your knowledge." Lionel looked at the desk. His jaw was set. She could see the cost of what he was absorbing, not just the betrayal of a man he had trusted for over a decade, but the realization that his own house had been used as an instrument against him, against both of them. "The land," he said at last. "What do you want to do with it?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it for 7 years, and with particular intensity for the past 3 weeks, lying awake in the large, cold room upstairs, listening to the rain and the silence and the occasional sound of his study door. "I want to negotiate," she said. He looked at her. "Not surrender it, not weaponize it." She kept her eyes on his face. "Negotiate. Fairly. With attorneys who work for both of us rather than against us. The railroad expansion needs that land. You need the route. I need security that doesn't depend on an arrangement with an 18-month expiration date." She let that land. "I think there is an agreement here that doesn't require either of us to lose." Lionel Beaumont was quiet for a long time. Outside, somewhere beyond the study window, Fairmont Hills was going about its morning. The telegraph office opening, the bank unlocking its doors, the households of the wealthy conducting the ordinary business of their ordinary power. None of them knew what was happening in this room. None of them had ever looked at Esther Whitcombe and seen anything more than a woman defined by her misfortune. "You walked into this house," he said quietly, "with more leverage than every man at the Aldgate table combined." "Yes," she said, "and you waited." "I needed to know who you were," she said, "before I decided whether you were someone I could trust with the truth." The expression on his face shifted, not into something soft, into something more honest than soft, something that acknowledged without theater that he had underestimated her in the specific way that men underestimate women who are quiet and composed and arrive with one traveling case in the rain. Not cruelly, simply automatically, and that the underestimation had been entirely his own failure. "And now?" he said. Esther picked up the deed from the desk. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back down, on his side. "Now I trust you with it," she said. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame and stopped. "Lionel," he looked at her. "The arrangement we signed has 14 months remaining." She held his gaze. "I'd like to discuss renegotiating the terms." She left the study. She walked down the corridor. She did not look back. By noon, Lionel Beaumont had sent a letter to Caldwell and Marsh, instructing them to prepare new documentation. By afternoon, a second letter had gone to Harlan Fitch's attorneys, informing them that the land claim was without legal foundation and that any further correspondence on the matter would be answered in court. Douglas Pratt was never again admitted to Beaumont House, and Esther Whitcombe, who had arrived in the rain with a single travelling case and a secret locked inside a brass-keyed drawer, sat in the library that evening with a book open in her lap and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Lionel came in at 7:30. He sat in his reading chair. He picked up his book. The lamp burned between them. The garden outside was dark and still. After a long while, without looking up from the page, he said, "You should have the study next to yours converted. If you're going to be managing land negotiations, you'll need a proper desk." Esther turned a page. "I already spoke to Graves," she said. The invisible heiress had shown at last who truly held the power at the table, and the empire, rebuilt on honest ground, would never look the same again.